All right, here we are in the middle section of our social studies newspaper for this week. We are talking all about the multicultural aspect of Arizona, meaning all the different cultures that add to our wonderful state and make it the state that it is today. So continuing on here, and I know there wasn't anything that was highlighted on the first page, but there will be some things to highlight on this page. So however it is that you're doing it, if you're highlighting on your screen, if you are taking notes, if you've printed out the newspaper to highlight, whatever way you choose to do it, just make sure you're taking note of the different sections that I point out to you. Arizona's multicultural communities. The main ingredients in Arizona soup, which sounds kind of strange, but if you think about soup and all the stuff that goes into it, you'll see that we're going to talk a lot about how Arizona is kind of like a big soup. And it's very similar to a comparison that we make to the United States in general, calling it the melting pot, that people from all different countries come to the United States. And so we're talking specifically about Arizona here, but we know that all across the United States there are people from so many different countries that have come here for many different reasons. The main ingredients in Arizona soup. In an earlier issue of Arizona Studies Weekly, we looked closely at many individual women and men. People like Barry Goldwater, Irma Bombeck, Sandra Day O'Connor, Ted DeGracia, and others have made a real difference in our Arizonan soup. It might be said that these are the seasonings of Arizona soup, and the same may be said of each of you. Now, instead of looking at individuals who helped make Arizona great, let's look at some of the groups or communities that have contributed to our recipe. You could say that these groups represent the meat, potatoes, carrots, and broccoli, or the main ingredients of Arizona soup. Oops, we forgot to warn you, don't read this issue when you're hungry. An individual is one person. So, Arizona's African American community. Who was the first African person in Arizona? You already know the answer. Do you remember Estevan? He came to Arizona with Fray Marcos as a scout more than 460 years ago. So we're going to go ahead and highlight that because that was the first, I don't know why that happens. That was the first African person that was here in Arizona more than 460 years ago. We're going to see that pop up later. It was more than 300 years before another person of African descent came to Arizona. In the 1850s, 2 African-American men came to Tucson from New Orleans and Oklahoma as free men. They were followed by others who came west to escape the awful persecution and discrimination they experienced in the East. Now, we talked about this during the Civil War, about the issues with slavery and the way African-Americans were treated. So a lot of them were trying to get away from that, the persecution and discrimination. Those are treating people badly based on the color of their skin, their race, their religion, things that are not within their control. So you'll see this pop up in one of the questions. We want to make sure we highlight that. By the year 1900, there were at least 86 African Americans living in Tucson alone. There were more if you included the rest of the territory. These early pioneers varied in their occupations, job, or career. Many owned businesses such as barbershops, mechanical repair shops, restaurants, lodging houses, and stores. Some worked for others, and a few owned ranches. Unfortunately, in terms of discrimination, society in the West wasn't much better than society in the East. It wasn't until the 1960s with the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that things started to change. Arizona's Mexican American community. Who built Arizona? Before the railroads arrived in the 1880s, a majority of supplies came into Arizona from Mexico. There were many wealthy Mexican ranchers and business owners. Mexican political leaders were common, especially in Tucson. European American men often married Mexican women. European and Mexican Americans worked together to build a thriving community. That means that the community was very prosperous, making lots of money and doing very well. When the railroads came, everything changed. European Americans were less dependent on supplies from Mexico. So after the railroads, we didn't really need supplies from Mexico anymore because we were able to get them from other places. So we're depending on other countries, not Mexico anymore, to get our supplies. And that had a big effect on Mexico, unfortunately. Mexico was doing really well because we were getting a lot of our supplies from them. So when we stopped, then that definitely had an effect on their economy. Wealthy Mexican families could not keep up with the wealth or those connected with the railroads. The wealth of those, connected with the railroads. Since then, discrimination has made success more difficult for Mexican Americans. Yet today, as with every other part of our multicultural society, great successes are easily found. This is especially true when there is a strong commitment to education. We're going to highlight that right there too, a strong commitment to education. Oh, I grabbed too much there. There we go. Strong commitment to education is an essential part of making our society better and blending a lot of different communities and cultures together. Arizona pie. What does pie have to do with Arizona society? Well, people have used charts for a long time to illustrate what portion of the overall population each group represents. One of the most common types of charts is called the pie chart. We call it this because it's round like a pie, and the individual groups shown in the chart are sliced up just like a pie. It makes it very easy to see how big one certain group is compared to all the other groups. Take a look at the Arizona pie chart shown here. Here it is down here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can easily see how each group compares in size to the other groups. You may notice we've labeled each group as blank Americans. This shows that we all have one very important thing in common, no matter where we came from. We are all Americans. A group with the word Americans attached means that the people are natives of America, but also of another culture. And so you can see all the different groups that contribute to Arizona, the largest being the non-Hispanic Americans. So there's our largest group. So I'm going to highlight that because you might see a question about that. And then here we have our American Indians, not necessarily the smallest group, but you're going to see those guys pop up on a question. So that's why I'm highlighting that for you. So you can see most of Arizona is made up of white non-Hispanic Americans and then Hispanic Americans and then a few other cultures represented in there as well. Okay. Arizona's Chinese community. The first Chinese in Arizona laid tracks for the railroad from Yuma to Tucson. So Chinese came here to work on the railroad. They were very, very good at building railroads. That's why they were brought in specifically to do that. They were known for their hard work and willingness to work for less money than white or Mexican Americans. This created bad feelings towards them as they took jobs away from those who were already in Arizona. These feelings turned to violence, which ended only when the railroad companies agreed to phase out the Chinese workers. Most of the workers returned to China or left to seek work in California, but a few stayed. Excuse me. A few stayed. The Chinese who stayed in Tucson were hardworking people who believed in education for their children. They farmed or owned restaurants, stores, laundry services, and other businesses. Don Hua and his family were community leaders in Tucson during the last half of the 20th century. As with other immigrants who came to Arizona and the United States, the Chinese faced discrimination in many forms. So other immigrants, meaning people that came to the United States from other countries, they faced discrimination in many forms. So we're going to highlight that there because it's important to recognize that word discrimination. But through education, hard work, and perseverance, never giving up, you're going to see that pop up later too, great improvements have been made. To learn more about the Chinese history in Arizona, go to parentsaisarizona.edu/promise. Arizona's American Indian community. We've learned a lot about American Indian history in Arizona this year, but let's look at what's happening nowadays in Arizona's American Indian community. After generations of going without, many tribes are cashing it in. But it has everyone arguing about what should and should not be. What does all that mean? Well, it all comes down to one 8-letter word. Are you ready for it? Here it is, gambling. At one time, the only place you could legally gamble in the whole United States was in Nevada. But in the last few years, American Indians have set up gambling casinos on reservations all over Arizona. It's important to know that that is how the American Indians in Arizona are making a lot of their money. They earn a living through the business of gambling. The casinos have brought some tribes from rags to riches in a very short time. For example, the Yavapai tribe's Fort McDowell Casino, which is just 20 minutes north of Phoenix, is bringing in millions of dollars of profit every year. Some people like the casinos. They are calling the American Indian gambling business the new buffalo because it's providing a rich source of support, just as the great herds of buffalo did for hundreds of years. They believe that tribal youth may get as much as $500,000 from their tribal trust funds when they turn 18 and graduate from high school. Others say that gambling is wrong and casinos only give people a way to waste their hard-earned money. For this reason, many people in the state government are trying to find a way to shut down the casinos. Still others say that the only reason the state government doesn't like it is that the casinos don't have to pay state taxes on their earnings. It's a pretty sticky, tricky issue because everyone seems to have a different opinion about what's right or wrong. The reservations can afford to build nice houses and schools for their tribal members. What do you think is the right thing to do? That'd be a really interesting conversation for you to have as a family. What do you think is right? Is it a good idea for these casinos to be open or a bad idea? It benefits the tribes for sure. Should it benefit our state government as well? There's a lot of different opinions out there, so that might be something interesting for you to talk about with your family at some point today. That's the end of this section. Tune in for the next video where we go over the very last section of our newspaper. See you guys in a bit.